Oliver Bethell. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. 2026 does sound like a very successful year for Google, but also a very challenging year. And we will discuss the recent and the latest and the forthcoming matters related to competition policy sensu lato. But I wanted to start this conversation with inviting you to reflect on 2025, also a very busy and very unusual year.
Thank you very much, Alice. It's very nice to see you again. I appreciate the opportunity to have these conversations with you. So yeah, look, we're very excited about 2026. I think there's a lot happening at Google and happening around Google. 2025 was an interesting year. I think as for many people, we had the feeling that we were operating in a sometimes intense and uncertain environment. Certainly something that we felt at Google. I think as a consequence of that, for those of us working on competition or working on things like the Digital Markets Act, there was perhaps a stronger sense of humility as to the limits of what we can do in antitrust and competition. There's lots of questions being asked of industry, lots of political questions of high import, and perhaps a sense of where do we draw the line between what competition law is able to do and what it's not. So that was definitely one reflection for us here at Google. It was also, of course, at that time, and I think we'll see even more of this in 2026, of quite ferocious, exciting competition and development in some of the key technologies that we're working on at Google. That has been very exciting to be part of, to witness that happening around us. We were very proud of the progress that we made with Gemini 3, our large language model, Nano Banana, our image generating model. So some huge advances within Google that are very exciting to bear witness to. And all of that happening in an environment where around us we see many similarly exciting launches taking place in what looks like it's turning out to be a quite competitive and rapidly evolving space. So that's the sort of platform from 2025 moving into 2026. And I think we look ahead to 2026, whether it's our engagement with regulators, the work that we do in competition, or the work we do in product launches and research, whether those feel to us very exciting places where one ought to be quite optimistic about what's ahead of us.
So let us then maybe start with looking at the DMA, and in particular the DMA investigations of Google compliance, search self-preferencing, unfair ranking, play, restrictions on developer steering, and the motion of media publisher content in search, which has been labeled by Google parasite SEO. Obviously, we can also include here the latest proceeding on the DMA, which is not investigation, but an attempt to find the happy medium with Article 611, how the licensing system is functioning. So can you reflect upon these developments?
Sure. So listen, the Digital Markets Act has been probably one of the largest, the most involved regulatory projects that we've been involved in here at Google. As you know, it covers 20 or so different rules applying to 8 core platform services for Google, and then a raft of other core platform services for others. As part of those processes, we're, of course, very directly engaged in the working groups that deal with questions of compliance for us across the various Digital Markets Act rules. But we're also very engaged in questions that we receive about other people's compliance, questions that we receive from industry, questions that we receive at workshops that the European Commission organises. So there is a huge volume of work attached to the Digital Markets Act that hasn't really let up through the course of 2025. So I suppose that's one observation. As I look across the areas where the Commission has focused its attention, I think there are perhaps some common themes that you can extract from those cases. They tend to deal with very challenging questions of how you balance various interests. In some cases, you're looking at security and privacy concerns and how you can balance that against proportionate access to some of the platforms that are covered by the Digital Markets Act. In other parts of DMA compliance, you have debates between different stakeholders who stand to benefit from compliance? How can those interests be aligned in a way that's fair, that achieves the goals of fairness and contestability that sit at the core of the Digital Markets Act? So I think those are a couple of themes that at least strike me as I look at the work that we've been doing through 2025. Another aspect is, of course, that several of those articles that you focus on involve a huge amount of underlying technical complexity. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of work and effort by us and by the Commission, to their credit, to try and understand the underlying technology so you can come out at the end of the process with a solution that makes sense, that's practicable, that's monitorable, that's going to achieve the kinds of outcomes that people have in mind. I think it's reassuring to see people spending so much time wrestling with the evidence and wrestling with the technologies. I think it's reassuring to see the Commission staffing up with more technical expertise. We talk to engineers now, we talk to economists and lawyers, of course, and I think that shows a real commitment to trying to find the right solution in very difficult and complicated spaces. And at the same time, of course, we all operate in DMA compliance discussions against the backdrop of a great demand for us to be efficient, to be streamlined, to be focused on measures that are going to improve productivity, that we're lowering the right barriers to entry in the places that are going to make a big difference for European consumers and businesses. So all of those things taken together put a lot of pressure on these teams. But it seems clear to me that people are committed to trying to find the right outcomes where they can.
I wanted to, in this connection, ask you, unlike traditional or exposed antitrust abuse of dominant cases where things are pretty much ad hoc, here we are talking about a kind of continuous condition of compliance, which creates a compliance culture or specific kind of relationship. You have to be in constant dialogue or multi-logue with different, primarily with the Commission, also with business users. I read that you're also in connection with end users or other categories or business users of your business users. This obviously is a new territory, essentially, which creates a different atmosphere. Can you kind of see, when you talk to people, to experts in the Commission, do you see that they look at your case, at each specific investigation in separation? Or they have a broader picture, even if it's a kind of jigsaw puzzle, they consider where to focus their priorities based on something kind of bigger, more strategic, or you don't even bother to think about it. You are focused on technical issues because these are of immediate concern for your company.
It's a very interesting question, Olis. Look, I think that oftentimes in a negotiation over compliance with a particular provision, the people who have, prepared and made the time to meet each other in a room somewhere in Brussels, there is a tendency to very much focus on the wording of that particular rule and the specific technologies to which it applies. And I think oftentimes that makes a lot of sense, but you're quite right that, of course, all of these rules and technologies are working as complements to one another. And I am often struck when I look at provisions that deal with data portability and interoperability, for example, they seem to me to be a very important bedrock that sits underneath a lot of what the other provisions are trying to do. So the interplay between the provisions, from a policy perspective at least, when you're thinking about, when we have our sort of reckoning at the end of 2026 and another assessment of whether we've made good progress, measuring that, I would posit against real metrics of improving productivity and growth and focusing on entry from real innovators. What have we done to achieve that? You will absolutely be looking at the joint effect of those different provisions. How do they complement one another? So I think that is an aspect. I'm sure that's something that the Commission thinks about. It's certainly something that we think about. Of course, when you hear some of the gatekeepers talking about the reasons for not doing particular things that they are asked to do, oftentimes you see familiar themes, privacy, security. I think it's important to look at those kinds of arguments in the round, right? Are people saying the same things on provision insofar as it relates to interoperability, and then how it relates to access to an app store, for example? I think it's important to be consistent. But more generally, as you say, when we're looking for the ways in which the Digital Markets Act can deliver growth and real change, which I continue to believe is possible, how do you think about the policy decisions you're going to take for where you're going to really focus your attention? I think going through 2025, when I look back on the year, I'm not sure that all of the time has been as focused as it could have been on the provisions that are going to have the most impact. As I say, interoperability, I understand why the Commission is now looking at that with us in the context of a specification process. I can understand why the Commission wants to make sure that that's working well, because from interoperability, you sort of create the fertile conditions for all types of entry. And then from there, perhaps you might have questions about specific distribution opportunities, but interoperability, data portability seems like a good bedrock condition to want to achieve in the first instance. So, my hope is that we can continue to have these kinds of conversations to focus our attention on the provisions that are going to have the most impact. And at the same time, of course, there may be some deprioritization of other provisions that, while compliance is a requirement, perhaps that's not the place where we spend all of our time most immediately if there are other provisions that are going to have a quicker, more immediate impact on the market.
Okay, but you mentioned prioritization, and we all know about this shortage in resources of the DMA team. So if you look at a catalog of the investigations and proceedings, taking account the latest two, which of those perplexed you most, so to say? Do you think out of the catalog of possible non-compliance or problematic issues, the DMA team has picked only a handful, I imagine, because the system is designed to make the burden of proof quite easy to mitigate in terms of resources and power, competences and the like. So the choice, the element of discretion was there. Some for you would say, with some issues you would say probably I was expecting it. Others came like big interest and surprise. Can you rank them?
I don't know if it's possible to rank. I mean, I think that as you say, the threshold for the Commission to want to examine in closer detail a particular provision is relatively low, and there's no finding of non-compliance until there's a finding of non-compliance. So, the Commission can take on as many provisions as it feels need to have that additional scrutiny. There's no bar to that, really. So, when I look at the particular topics that the Commission has looked at, I do think you see a little bit of and this was quite obvious to all of us as we were thinking about the legislation when it was being formed. There are sort of the DMA wasn't born in a vacuum, right? There were preceding concerns around particular big tech issues that applied to platforms. And you see, in the first round of some of those investigations that the Commission picked up, you sort of see a sort of focus on provisions that were intended to address things that they were continuing to hear about, notions of self-preferencing, access to app stores. So I think the fact that we went there early in the process wasn't a huge surprise. It seemed quite natural. We've worked very hard to try and address those concerns as we have gone. One of the reasons, in my humble opinion, that those cases took a long time in the past is because not a function of dilatory tactics or people playing the system, but because they genuinely are very complicated issues that require a huge amount of work for the regulator to balance the various interests and figure out what the right solution is. And I think we're seeing some of that also in the DMA. Provisions that are picking up some of those theories of harm are also facing challenges as they try and strike the right balance. I think we can get through them, but it's very clear that there's not straightforward cases. I think in the more recent round of investigations that the Commission has started to pick up, I think there's a quite natural focus on how does the DMA ensure that this new wave of quite remarkable and exciting competition coming from AI services, how can the DMA facilitate entry and expansion in that space? It seems very sensible to me. I absolutely understand why the Commission would choose to do that. We're a great believer in open platforms and competition. We understand the responsibility that comes with being the owner of big platforms on which you yourself compete. I think we're very experienced in that area, and hopefully that will help us navigate our way through quickly. But I mean, I think looking forward, it seems quite natural that would be an area that the Commission would want to focus on outside of the DMA, or in fact, as we come to sort of bring perhaps new services into the scope, more fully into the scope of the Digital Markets Act. I think it's also quite predictable that the Commission would want to look at cloud services. and to think about, well, okay, how should the Digital Markets Act be applying? Why is it that we don't have core platform services yet? How do we think about who ought to be within scope? Because just as with interoperability for AI services and for large language models, thinking about how that sort of key backbone infrastructure is accessible to all of the innovators in Europe seems to me a very important and obvious place to focus.
Absolutely. And I have a question about cloud investigation, but I wanted to finish with this one. If we look at a catalog of current investigations and other proceedings, kind of, which would lead to specification decisions, supposedly, well, let's say consultations, I wonder if there is any kind of things without disclosing details, without disclosing even any cards, just the very way confirming or disproving the very thinking that is it a big deal for Google to be so or not so, just to say why should we and try to protect your natural business interests? How much is at stake? Is it a kind of where is the Achilles heel out of this several? And if there is an Achilles heel or something which is more important than other, is there any interplay between different investigations where you could say, look, we can play a whack-a-mole game, or we can somehow compromise a little bit here, but in return we expect you to focus your limited resources, huge discretion, on something which is probably more important for Europe or whatever.
So, there's a lot in that question. So let me just try and unpack it a little bit. I think that when it comes to the question, it doesn't cross our mind, I would say, as to sort of where's an Achilles heel, where's an area where we will not go. And when we look at the Digital Markets Act and the way it applies to our core platform services, it's clear to us that we have an obligation to comply to the full extent of the law across all of those provisions. There's no doubt as to that. I do think, as we discussed earlier, the notion of having a real focus on those provisions that are most likely to deliver the kinds of outcomes that the Commission, the citizens in the European Union are hoping to derive from the Digital Markets Act is important. And again, to come back to this notion of interoperability, I think there are some of those bedrock ideas that if we can do them well and we can ensure that they are working very well, they may actually have a sort of halo effect on some of the other provisions, right? If I can ensure that users can move quickly between different core platform services, if I can ensure that those core platform services are going to be open and accessible while still safe, which seems to me an achievable thing. We've done it in Android. So if that can be achieved, I think you ought to be able to have a conversation about, well, okay, to what extent now do we now complement, how deep does one now need to go in other provisions that may also go to a similar effect? We've sort of restored, there's a competitive pressure that we've improved quite significantly in this area, and how does that affect how we think about the obligations that will abide elsewhere? I think, as I say, the fact that they're a legal requirement is what it is, but there is a prioritization that I think you can apply to the work that you're doing. None of this is it's a get out of jail free card. I don't think that just because you've done well on 6.5 lets you off the hook for 6.4, right? I mean, that's not the way it operates, and I would never propose such a thing to the Commission. But what I will ask the Commission as we go into 2026 is, where should we be thinking about the areas that are of most import to the policy goals and objectives for the European Commission writ large, right? We want to ensure that, to the best of our ability, the Digital Markets Act improves implementation opportunities on top of AI infrastructure. That seems to me an important place for European growth and innovation. What are the things that are most important there? It can't be that all 22 rules are equally important for that kind of growth and expansion. How do we prioritize? How do we understand the places that the Commission wants to give the most urgent direction to the evolution of the technology, so that we can shift our focus there also, while at the same time ensuring that everything else is sufficiently compliant, but spending most of our time on those high priority areas.
And a quick question. And do you think that the DMA regime is maturing or regulatory dialogue is maturing in a way that you can get at least non-verbal reading from the communication with the commission that such areas can be somehow indicated? You or any other gatekeeper?
I mean, look, I think I would say it's still early days for the Digital Markets Act, to be very frank with you, Olis. I think that we're doing good work to establish relationships of trust on both sides. I hope that that's the case, and I hope the Commission would say the same. There are difficult areas where we will disagree, where we have disagreed, and I'm sure we will in the future. That's quite natural in such a broad and complicated regulatory regime. I think there is space for sort of more imagination and creativity in how the regulatory dialogue operates in practice. I think there is always a risk with a piece of legislation like the Digital Markets Act that you fall back to the things that you know best, and things that you know best are fines and RFIs and conference panels, and perhaps there's space still for experimentation and innovation in the ways in which you think about how you talk to each other, right? What kinds of things can we be doing to understand the things that you think are most important? What kinds of evolutions in the technology are you focused on the most? Is every API equally important to you? Are you hearing from very credible, exciting innovators in a particular space that they need a particular thing? Shall we have a workshop with them? Shall we work together on trying to find solutions? Are we bringing the right people to Brussels? Are you bringing the right people from the Commission? I still think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'd like to see more innovation and more creativity in the ways in which we think about how we're going to operate in this regulatory dialogue. And as I say, there is always, I think, the gravitational pull of, well, let's do it the adversarial way. Let's do it the way that we used to, series of RFIs, a decision that we try and parse, the risk of non-compliance fines and appeals, etc., etc. I think it would be a shame if we sort of felt that gravitational pull and were unable to resist it.
You mentioned on a few occasions AI for obvious reasons, because of the pivotal importance of this technology in general, but primarily, or not least, to search, which is the starting point of Google ecosystem and still probably one of the main pillars of Google. I wanted to ask you, how do you see the impact of large language model services on the on Google as a household name, on Google as verb? And where do you see other opportunities and risks of AI through the prism, looking through the prism of the DMA?
That's a good question. So let me just take a step back first, which is, so when we talk about, there are plenty of panels and discussions, and whether it's in the antitrust community or more broadly around kind of the impact of AI. What's AI going to mean for competition, risks and opportunities, and what's AI going to mean more broadly in society? So a number of big questions swirling around, and just to give a sense of how I think about some of the core concepts and how they might apply therefore to competition. So I think we think of AI as what you might call a sort of general purpose technology here at Google. So it's something that's going to imbue many, many, many different services and accelerate and evolve the ways in which we're able to interact with them. And search is, of course, one of those things you've mentioned, but there are many, many places where this general purpose technology will be deployed. And as a consequence of its deployment, what we expect to see is a tremendous improvement in productivity, right? The speed with which we will be able to execute particular tasks, create particular things, find new ideas. And this is one of the things that's quite remarkable to me when I hear is the way in which that general purpose technology can be deployed in many different fora, and allows us not only to answer questions that we would want to ask of the technology, but at the same time to also find the new questions that we would want to ask of it, right? And how AI can help us with those kind of exploratory exercises, I think is fascinating. It's going to provide us with the ability to make better decisions when we are going about our daily lives. And increasingly, I think what you'll see is that the AI in its deployment will start to execute some of the tasks that we would not want to do ourselves, to automate those tasks in ways that will make us much more efficient. So I think those are some of the ways in which we'll see AI deployed, and I think leading to great benefits and opportunities. Now, as part of those deployments, you've asked me about what that means in search, and I think one of the things that always strikes me as interesting in that part of the debate is that search, of course, has been deploying AI for a long time. It's not just the advent of the Geminis of this world or the ChatGPTs that have sort of encouraged us to deploy AI within search. We've been doing it for a long time. When you think about suggested queries, there are a variety of different ways in which we've been deploying language models across the technology for a long time. So to some extent, when you look at those deployments within search, you're looking at an evolution. Search is improving on the way in which it's able to answer any question and provide an answer in any format. That's sort of the core purpose of search. It's always intended to be a universal search engine. I think that AI accelerates that. As we, of course, think about the competition rules that are attached to search, which are now well known, some of those enshrined within the Digital Markets Act, it's very clear to us that, of course, whether an answer comes from an analog technology or from an AI technology, it's subject to the same rules, right? The research results are the search results, however they've come about. And so when we look at what we're doing now within search within Europe, we know that we're subject to 6.5 of the DMA. That will apply also across the AI-generated answers. That's obvious to us. So what we try and do in our discourse with the Commission is to ensure that we have principles that are sufficiently future-proof to ensure that you don't have to keep on coming back to the discussion as a new search feature evolves. That wouldn't make sense. You need to have clear self-referencing principles that can be applied as the technology evolves. You asked me a little bit about, where else might we see interesting sort of competition issues or discussions evolving. I think one of the things that's clear to me, at least, is at the moment you do see at certain places in the AI infrastructure, in the AI stack, there is a concentration. You're seeing huge amounts of investment when it comes to infrastructure, data centers, chips, energy, increasingly. And as competition practitioners, as we see sort of a market concentrate, we ask ourselves questions about what does that, how many competitors do we need to have in this space? And I think that's an important question that we're going to be asking ourselves moving forward as those capital expenditures increase over the next years. We think there are probably around 30 models now that are at the scale of GPT-4. Is there enough competition with that many players competing? You tend to see the leaderboards of the most advanced models shifting back and forth between Grok and Gemini and others. We see a fair amount of shifting positions amongst those big players. But is it enough? What should competition be doing there? I think that's going to be a good and sensible question. If there is enough competition at that level with those providers, what does it mean for access and pricing for others? I think it's some interesting questions when you start to think about the implementation layer. If it's going to be competition in the applications that sit on top of large language models, if that's where we're going to see growth and productivity gains, what should we be doing to ensure that can be as unencumbered and as competitive as possible? It brings me back again, I think, to this notion of interoperability and portability. It seems to me that ensuring that Olis's app is able to compete on the same terms as a first-party app on a particular large language model that the first party also owns. Those kinds of questions, I think, will be increasingly important. So, look, I think there are lots of places where there will be sensible questions to be asked. Consolidation at the infrastructure level. How much competition do we want to preserve there? Is it feasible for 100 players to be operating at that scale, or is it sort of a natural consolidation to a smaller number of companies who can afford to make those kinds of investments, but therefore we ensure that access is on fair terms, and then when it comes to implementation, that we're seeing sort of vibrant entry and expansion amongst other players, because that's where we see that there are going to be opportunities for more competition. So those are the kinds of things that I think are on my mind. A final thought, I suppose, is that none of this slows down, right? The kinds of the advances that are being made, whether it's investment in data centers, whether it's the launches of new models, the expansion of their capabilities, all of that is happening extremely quickly. And one of the things that we've often talked about in competition, and I remember when the Digital Markets Act was first being discussed, was how do we ensure that we move quickly enough so that we're not just sort of legislating for the past, And that's a very acute concern, I would say, now as the technology moves faster and faster, to ensure that we can keep up and that competition agencies have the right mechanisms for engaging with the companies, providing direction, while at the same time ensuring that we don't get caught up in regulatory dialogues that slows everything down.
And this probably is a nice opportunity for us to move to the system, to the regime, which is more agile, supposedly, or could be, let's say, according to the rule, as the rules are designed. It gives the discretion to the UK. I mean, it gives the discretion to the CMA to fine-tune, calibrate obligations, conduct requirements, basing on the development and evolution of markets, but also to sit on their hands and focus on further kind of learning process and enriching our learning, our knowledge in this field. But before moving to the UK, I have a question about clouds. And we have very important investigations in the European Union under the DMA regime, where probably two largest cloud providers are considered to be designatable, or this will be whether they are platforms, whether they provide services to, whether they are gatekeepers between business users and users. There are many questions, but if let's hypothesize, if they are designated, do you think there will be the second-tier companies, newcomers, or kind of middle-sized companies, which are considered traditionally through the logic of the DMA as the main beneficiaries, the new entrants, which will be able to use the opportunity? And the sub-question, how should we look at the companies who are by no means the medium-sized companies, who are equally strong, omnipotent, omnipresent, who are even designated as gatekeepers, but for other core platform services, if they use this opportunity to enter the market, which is quite concentrated?
So, when we think about technology markets where there's a concern around concentration leading to adverse effects on competition, which has been found for the cloud market in the UK, those findings exist. When you look at those kinds of markets and you want to take a position on the kind of entry and expansion that you want to stimulate to ensure competition so that some of those adverse effects hopefully diminish, I don't think there's the qualification as to where we expect the competition to come from, whether it should come from a large company, a small company, a medium-sized company. What we're saying is that this market is excessively locked in. We're seeing in the case of cloud overcharging for consumers. We're seeing in the case of cloud a dearth of multi-homing, and we want to improve on that. We want to ensure that the prices are competitive, and we want to ensure that there's more opportunities to multi-home. That's sort of the core tenet that sits behind, I would posit, some of the work that the CMA has done in this area. And so therefore, if we can do anything to improve on that, if we can allow any companies to move into that space and apply competitive pressure, come one, come all, I think should be the invocation. And so that's how I really think about it. And of course, we operate in the cloud service. You're very diplomatically sort of making the point. We operate in cloud. With Google Cloud Platform. We are a third player in that space. We want to compete more. There should be opportunities for all, we say. We argue on behalf of all entrants that that what we see as some of the practices that are making that more difficult for us, make it more difficult for everyone. And I think insofar as we're able to make a particular market more competitive, we shouldn't be trying to qualify the type of competition that we want to introduce into the market. And of course, if a market that has two players becomes more competitive because there are now three effective players, that may not be the end of the story. And we absolutely understand that. The competition or scrutiny doesn't shift away automatically when you hit the magic number of three. So that's certainly the case. And I think you've seen, it's interesting in the UK, when I think about the work that we've done in cloud, an awful lot of that was answering questions about what we're doing in cloud in the UK. This wasn't just about Azure, although that's where the Competition and Markets Authority ended their market investigation, of course. But there was a lot of scrutiny of what we were doing in that space, and we welcomed that. We were very ready to talk about what we were doing. We were very ready to take direction as to how we should be thinking about our business practices, we will remain open to that. But I do think it's important to welcome and to invite competition from everyone in a space where we're not seeing sufficient competition, which seems to be the case in the cloud market in Europe.
And if you look, so from my kind of academic Machiavellian perspective, which is not particularly popular, but I think that I'm stick to this position. Do you think, I personally think that it would be healthy for probably least desirable format of this inter-ecosystem competition, but most plausible, least desirable from the perspective of kind of DMA idealists, let's say, most plausible one. And I look at the example in the United States where your company has been the trial in search case where Microsoft was basically assisting, let's say, to the DOJ with technical competence, mitigating somehow the asymmetry of knowledge and nuances which the parties, the plaintiff and the defendant possess in these highly technical cases. Would Google be available to inform somehow or steer or maybe outsource in other way limited resources of the commission in this type of investigations? Obviously, not as a kind of pro bono strategy, but benefiting from it, but and yet making the job of public enforcer more efficient.
Look, when I put myself in the shoes of a public enforcer, which I try to do, that it seems to me that the sheer scope and complexity and dynamism of the markets that you're being asked to now to regulate and to scrutinize is formidable. And it's unclear to me how large a regulatory agency would need to be able to do that all unilaterally, effectively, right, across all of these different markets, these different platforms, the international scope. There's a huge amount there, so that's just not plausible. So I think in that context, I would very much be looking to industry to provide me with technical expertise, with evidence and data. I think it's really important in that kind of exchange with industry to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, to not be directed by opinion or disgruntled complaint. Right, that's all going to come, of course, but I think your job as a regulator is to filter and to make sure that you're asking the right questions, to discriminate between flaky evidence and real compelling evidence. And I think that's the job that you need to be doing. But as part of that, the invitation into the funnel and the filter has to be broad, and you do have to go to industry to ask for that kind of assistance. And it's something that we've never shied away from in all areas whether we're asked about our views on interoperability, on artificial intelligence, on the cloud industry. We will always stand ready to engage with regulators. We see that as part of the development of your relationship as a trusted partner. It can't always be that you're participating when you're just in a defensive mode. You have to invest in assisting the regulator in other areas. And I think oftentimes, even though it may not seem immediately obvious to you, that kind of engagement will be to your advantage, because if I can ensure that Olis and his team understand well how the cloud market operates, in fact, when you're asking questions about what we do, you'll come from a bedrock of understanding, which I think is useful to us also. So that's our attitude to information sharing, to engagement at a technical level with the regulators. I think there's, perhaps one observation. I think, one has to be careful about being the company that's trying to steer the decision making. That's not for you to make. It's for the regulator, for the court to make the ultimate decision. Your job is to provide technical expertise and evidence. And then, as I say, it's for the regulator to filter the answers and the input, but also for the regulator to be doing its best to prioritize the questions that are most important. We touched on this, I think, a bit earlier in our call today. There is an awful lot of information requests and exchanges taking place at the moment around us globally. And so if you're looking to get very focused feedback on a particular issue, whether it's relating to Google's compliance or our observations on someone else's compliance, the more that we can really focus in on the things that matter, the priority issues, the more we will be able to do in that space. if we take a sort of peanut butter approach to the questions, like we ask questions about everything to the same degree, then what will tend to happen, I think, is you'll see people relying more on chatbots to provide generic answers to questions than doing the kind of in-depth technical work that's going to be most helpful in these kinds of cases.
Staying within this, let's say, pragmatic modality, I wanted to ask your reflection on kind of a very powerful metaphor which has been coined by Christina Cafara, namely about the kind of the DNA of gatekeepers. And she refers to a novel of Guggengass. It's the novel, name of the novel. So to cut a long story short, the idea is that the gatekeeper are living in the cloud, in the sky, in a castle, and occasionally they hear somebody is knocking on their door, and they look, who are you? You want to dance or you want to perform? You want to entertain us? Okay, maybe now, maybe next week. Do it, but don't move the furniture. This kind of approach that whatever we do, uh, regulators, enforcers, business users, other stakeholders, the gatekeepers are unbeatable because they have designed this business model probably 10 years ago. And now what is in the minds of their best engineers, nobody even can imagine in this regulatory bubble. If this kind of tonality itself, maybe it's a little bit, maybe I caricaturized it a little bit, but if the flavor is right, first of all, do you agree that there is a kind of generational gap in knowledge, competences, resources, agility, and all other skills necessary these days between gatekeepers and all of us mortal people? And is this relationship, is this description accurate to what extent?
I think there's some truth as I understand Christina's metaphor. I think there's certainly some truth to the observation that there will be asymmetries of information at times between technology companies and regulators. And I think that's absolutely inevitable and particularly in an environment now where AI is moving at breakneck speed and all of the products, if we operate within a company, I can tell you this now as someone within Google, I've been at Google for 17 years, it's unclear to me where our products will evolve to in the next 6 months. How can I possibly expect for a regulator to be ahead of that? Also to have some sort of, premonition about where the technology will be at the end of even 2026. So I think you have to sort of go into these conversations understanding that there will be a high degree of uncertainty and there will be asymmetries of information that you need to tackle and address. I think perhaps where the metaphor falls apart a little for me, again, as best I understand it, is the notion that you sit in an ivory tower on a cloud somewhere with scant regard for the people who are interested in asking you questions to further their understanding of the technology. I don't think that's the case. That's not my experience, at least at Google. I think there's a very, I think, and again, it is quite easy to caricature some of the big tech companies as all operating the same way and being kind of, as I say, this far removed gods on a mountain. The truth is that each of these companies, each of the institutions that we work with, is a collection of individuals with their own incentives and desires and ambitions. And when you start working with the people at Google, from our CEO down to someone like me, you will understand that they have a strong interest in wanting to do the right thing, to understand what the regulators' goals and objectives are, and to try and do the right thing. There will always be areas of disagreement, but there will certainly be areas of agreement. And the goal for people like me is to expand the latter and reduce the former as much as we can. So I think that we're very much part of the community. I think we have to do what we can to ensure that people have a good understanding of what we're doing now more than ever as AI accelerates things at such pace. And so I think, while I can sympathize for sure with the notion of asymmetries of information that are challenging for regulators, I don't think that means that companies like Google and the regulators are not prepared to work together to address them.
2025 and actually the beginning of 26 was busy not only in the EU but also in the UK for Google. We know that the first designation decisions have been issued by the CMA, and just recently in January, the consultation is open for the first conduct requirements. So maybe I wanted to invite maybe to reflect upon the substance of conduct requirements and how what's the strategy in terms of participating in this consultation of yours?
Sure. So the CMA has designated three companies, well, three services or three activities, as you know, at this point. It's search and app stores for us and app stores for Apple. Those were long and involved processes to understand the boundaries of the designation. It doesn't map neatly to a product market definition analysis. It's something different. We did a lot of work. We had sort of two of those processes running in parallel, which was a challenging exercise for the United Kingdom. We worked as best we could in a collaborative way, I think a quite productive way, with the Competition and Markets Authority to come to sensible designations in both of those areas. Now we move, you're quite right, to the conduct requirements phase of the CMA's work. Of course, conduct requirements can come at a future point also. But in this first phase, the CMA rather has started with search and is focusing on a number of ideas that it's now put to the market, dealing with various different issues, controls for publishers over how their content is used within search, choice screens, and then how services are being ranked within our search services. So there's a fair few ideas now that have gone to consultation. This is the CMA's consultation. It's their opportunity to test the ideas that they think are worth pursuing. We, of course, work with the Competition and Markets Authority for a large period before they moved to consultation. We've done a lot of work to ensure that they have met with our engineers, understand the underlying products, understand some of the complexities of the ecosystems in which we operate, some of our product plans and ambitions in any event for the United Kingdom, and in the hope that we can come to solutions that are both fit for purpose for the process that the CMA is running, but at the same time promoting opportunities, productivity, and growth in the United Kingdom. It's a new type of process for us. I'll tell you that. I think it has been generally a positive experience for us. I think that one of the great benefits of the DMCCA is it provides the regulator with more flexibility as to the things that it wants to focus on and the ways it wants to design the solutions. We've touched on that a little bit, I think, through the course of our conversation. And it seems to me that as the desire to be focusing on growth and productivity becomes more acute, and that happens against the backdrop of tremendous technological acceleration, you need the tools to be nimble. You need the tools to be focused. You need to give the regulator the ability to find new ways of interacting with the technology companies. And I think that the CMA has that in the DMCCA and is using that so far in a way that seems quite sensible to us.
Well, who do you love more, father or your father or your mother type of question? It's too early, of course, and it would be a little bit brutal even to say it. But just wanted to ask you, maybe if you look at the very formula of conduct requirements, which are much more kind of cherry pick, much more discretional and tailored, bespoke, allow the inject into it most of this regulatory compromise, let's say, coming from the regulatory dialogue, and compare it with obligations, DMA obligations of Article 5.6, 5.7, which are also interpretable but are considered stereotypically as kind of, and they start from day one. Yeah, that's what most important. Do you think, or what's your reflection if you embark on this comparative exercise? Which one is more effective, not for the regulatees, but for the system as such?
I think, listen, the Digital Markets Act has been enforced for longer. So I think, as you say, it's not only is it hard to choose between your parents, but it's also hard to sort of find the right moment for giving the final assessment. But as things currently stand, we have been quite public about our observations that, while on the one hand, parts of the Digital Markets Act seem to have delivered outcomes that seem quite sensible to us. The data portability provision has led to, I think, positive feedback from from industry. I think they have found good opportunities. We have a data portability API that's a direct consequence of the Digital Markets Act. Choice screens and are now live for both Google and Apple in ways that they weren't before the Digital Markets Act. So there has been some development, some quite positive development, I would say. At the same time, there are areas of the Digital Markets Act which are quite strict, that are quite formalistic, that have led to perhaps a lot of extended debate amongst competition practitioners and industry as to what the fair outcome ought to be. And 6.5, I think, is a good example of this. What is the right self-preferencing solution? We're seeing instances of people losing traffic when we've tried to launch a solution that satisfies, or we think would satisfy, one set of players. It's quite material drops in traffic for other players. We want to keep sort of retailers and hotels and airlines having the opportunity to compete now more than ever in Europe and to drive forward productivity and growth. At the same time, we know we have obligations to intermediaries and need to ensure that they have prominence on the search results page. So some of those discussions have been quite challenging for us. I'm ever the optimist. I think even there, we can find a way through if there's good faith and commitment to that on both sides. There certainly is on our side. In comparison, the CMA famously now does have more flexibility, is able to be more nimble and focused in the areas that it wants to focus on. They don't have to deal with 20 plus codified laws. They can deal with a smaller set of things that sit within a particular activity that they've designated. And we will see, as I say, this consultation is going to be an interesting experience for us. We'll see how the CMA's ideas are perceived by industry. Hopefully we avoid sort of diverting off into the lay-by of sort of an endless attempt to balance countervailing ideas. I think the CMA's proposals seem, we will engage with them. They seem sensible to us. We think we can perhaps work with them, but let's see how the consultation goes. And let's measure it. Perhaps, this time next year we can have a conversation. And I think when we have that conversation, it will be important to not just see whether we've got a series of check marks against whether the law was complied with or not, or the conduct requirement, but has it delivered? All right, what have we actually seen? Are you and I able to actually point to examples of new players using a particular API? Are we able to identify choice opportunities that consumers appreciate and use? I think that's the real test, and that will be the place where we need to assess whether we've made progress. On the other hand, are you and I now talking about a series of adversarial proceedings that are on their way to the CAT and to the general court? In that case, it will seem to have been perhaps less of a success, in my view.
And this, I wanted to ask you also about business, if we still have a couple of minutes, about given the flexibility and discretional elements in both regimes, a lot or considerable amount of attention depends on how vocal, eloquent, organized, mobilized, and prudent the business users are. Channeling the message, shaping the message, and somehow supporting specific issues, focusing attention of the enforcers on specific issues. As an observer, can you say that there are some good examples of some group of business users, some alliances, some collaborations where you can say they squeeze most out of these both regimes, and they appear to be most strategically mobilized, organized, and effective, perhaps?
I wish I was just an observer. I think I'm more on the pitch these days. But it's hard to identify a particular organization or association that I would say is the most effective mobilizer. I will say that some of the attributes, I can certainly talk about some of the attributes of what I think leads to a successful organization. I think that there are perhaps a couple of things that maybe won't come as a huge surprise to you. I think that a willingness to appreciate that the opinions of you and your members will sit within a broader context of opinions, and fairness and contestability is an exercise in balancing of different interests. So coming into a conversation, like any conversation or negotiation, where you know that you may not get everything that you wish for, right? Whether you're the Google participant, the Trade Association, the European Commission, I think having that humility and patience is a really important asset for anyone looking to achieve an outcome for itself as a business or for a group of businesses. Second, how can you engage in a discussion in a way that's based on real evidence? I mean, you will be surprised by the amount of submissions that we read through, and it's very, very difficult. There's lots of opinion and emotion sometimes, but to cut through that and get to, the real impact of a particular idea or provision on the people who are voicing a concern or supporting a notion, sometimes that's very, very difficult to parse. And I think one of the challenges can be often, with the greatest of respect to the legal community, if you sit behind a bench of lawyers, it sometimes is difficult to get to the kind of technical evidence that most cuts through. And that's a challenge for us also at Google. I do my best to bring people to the discussions with the Commission who not only are building the products, but also have the wherewithal to provide the data and evidence to support what they're saying. I think that's crucial if you want to achieve some sort of cut through. So I think those kinds of things are important. Look, when it comes to compliance and the creativity and imagination that you need to come up with good options, neither the gatekeeper nor the regulator has exclusivity. And I think that trade associations who sort of come and the observation is that we just don't like this. That's fine. It's fine to shoot down the idea, but so much better, so much more productive to be coming to the debate with, look, here are some other solutions. Here are some compromises that we have in mind. You may not like them all, but perhaps it moves the debate forward. And oftentimes in engagement that I've had, we've tried our best over the course of the last couple of years to really get into the weeds of industry, right? To spend as much time, if not more, than we are spending with the Commission, talking to retailers, talking to businesses, talking to app developers. What is it that you really want from this solution? And in the course of those conversations, it's not unusual to come across a sort of a diamond in the rough, right? Here's an idea that we can use as a feature of our solution. And if you can come to the discussions with that in mind, I think that can be a very, very sensible way of engaging. So sort of humility, evidence, and creativity. Those are the three main assets I would say at least are helpful for that kind of engagement.
In competition cycles, we traditionally see the development of competition philosophy from a couple of jurisdictions: United States, European Union, few others. You said you're in Google for 17 years, but it's quite a period. Now you are responsible for Google competition compliance policy globally. So I wanted to ask you, Oliver, about new experience new observations you get from this kind of 200 plus countries. Do you see different regulatory, or obviously they're different, but maybe how patchy the world actually is and how self-focused our kind of liberal democratic or Western bubble is, how representative the processes which are taking place in EU, in Europe and in America are. What's going on in the rest of the world?
So it's a big question. So I suppose one of the observations since we last spoke, you and I, in the course of 2025, has been that I think plenty of the regulators internationally, outside of the big two who we talk to, are observing what's happening with the Digital Markets Act and now with the DMCCA to understand what the right way might be. They're sort of two very helpful natural experiments. And one of the things that I've observed has been quite a healthy, I think, sort of questioning of, well, which bits of these would we want or not want? And I think it's quite interesting when you look at the Japanese Smartphone Act to see how there's clearly an awareness, but not an automatic importing of all of the ideas that you see in the Digital Markets Act. And it seems like a very sensible thing to be doing, to be using your imagination and the evidence and feedback that you're seeing around those acts that are a little bit ahead to understand what you want to do as a regulator. I also think that one of the very healthy things that I'm observing that may have been happening for a long time, but I'm just observing it now, is that every regulator has the primary focus is on ensuring that they achieve good outcomes for their consumers and their businesses, right? I mean, and the circumstances in Korea may be very different from the circumstances in the United Kingdom, and there may be things that you want to prioritize there that are not so pressing in the UK. And that's a very healthy thing for us to be doing. I think we've we've for countries that have been very mobile forward and focused on that part of industry, that's I think is a healthy thing for us to be doing. It helps us prioritize our time and our efforts in the ways in which we engage. So those I suppose are some high level observations. I will also say this again. One of the things that each of these institutions does have in common with the others is that you can't really describe them at the level of the institution. It's not that the JFTC is one thing, the EC is another thing, and the CMA is another. Each one of these regulators is a collection of, as I say, a collection of individuals. And it's really one of the things I've learned over the course of this process since I've been at Google is not to make determinations as to how a particular regulator operates. It's the people you're working with, right? There are policy decisions that are taken at the highest levels, but those too are made by individuals who you have to develop a relationship of trust with. And I think that that's something that I see across my work with all of the regulators, is that the more that you can be in the room with the individuals, understand what they're trying to achieve, understand the pressures that they are under, understand what they're hearing from industry, from the community around them, help them understand you and your situation within a company that's doing what Google is doing, then you're going to find areas where you can reach agreement. And then I think there are opportunities for sort of moving forward the regulatory project in a way that's going to be best for society.
The last question before inviting you to provide recommendations to students is, I know we can spend an hour discussing this, but yet Europe future plans in terms of training their muscles, becoming more competitive globally. Again, AI, cloud, infrastructure, all these things raise challenges and opportunities. So it's not only about challenges, about resilience, it's also about huge opportunities. And we see stereotypically two extremes with these kind of plans. One is just try to do it, try to copy. I leave aside people who say, let us do it in a way which don't exploit users' data, etc. It's kind of idealistic, or we will be planting. I personally think it's a nice strategy to get 0.1% market share or something of this kind. Who try to copy, let's say. So those who more strategic, proposing for Europe to copy and try to, maybe not all platforms, maybe not all because the time passed. And those who say, let us integrate with or collaborate with already mature players, try to find maybe our place not in Champions League, but in Europa League, somewhere in the second tier, and yet being very powerful and important because the market, the size of the pie is so big.
So, I mean, as a couple of observations, another very, very big and fascinating topic. The nature of what Europe can do when it comes to AI and technological advancements is, of course, a much broader conversation than just what you and I tend to spend our day job doing: competition law and its application. When we think at the highest levels of the famous Draghi report and the inputs to ensuring that the European Union is competitive are multitudinous and often not related to competition law. The access to risk capital, the investment in research, regulation is clearly part of that, and competition, a part within that part. And what can we be doing to ensure that it's doing its job to stimulate productivity and growth? So just to make that high level point that what we talk about here sits in that broader context. But to tackle your question more head on, and what does it mean then for us to be? What should we be driving towards, even in our sub part of this is the competition community? Should we be looking to stimulate growth? Copy what's happening in the US around the hyperscaling and the building of infrastructure and the building of data centers. If we're not doing that, are we perhaps moving down into the first or second division? Look, I think so. Two observations. First of all, I perhaps don't agree that necessarily there's a hierarchy of places where we ought to be introducing competition. It may well be that looking ahead, the real competition, the opportunities for real efficiency and growth are going to be in the implementation layer. How do you deploy AI in ways that are going to be most innovative, most contributing to creativity and to growth How are we going to get that right? Is that an implementation opportunity for the European Union? Because if that's the place where competition is going to have the biggest impact on productivity, I'd say that is a Champions League opportunity for the European Union. So, let's not sort of think about you have to have data centers to be the most successful. It is the case when you look at that part of the value chain, if you like, that the amount of investment and the speed with which that is taking place for hardware infrastructure, cloud, access to chips, is moving tremendously quickly. And there's eye-watering amounts of investment. That's very obvious to anyone who looks at this space. I think McKinsey's recently predicted seven trillion of capex investment in AI infrastructure by 2030. I think is one of the numbers that's out there at the moment. So, sort of circling back to the beginning of our conversation, is that the place where we should be focusing our attention in the European Union? Is the desire to sort of add a fifth player, a fifth European player to that part of the value chain? Potentially. I mean, it seems like there's a lot going on there already, and there's a lot of investment there already. And how many players can really be successful globally in that space? And it's an interesting question that you perhaps need to wrestle with first. But even if it is the case that there will be a smaller set of hyperscalers, and we're happy with the degree of competition between them, that doesn't, as I say, mean that through the rest of the value chain that there aren't huge opportunities for the European Union. And I do think that, once you move down to the implementation layer, you think about the opportunities for applications of this technology, which, as I've said before, is a general purpose technology that can be deployed across industry, across services. There may be places there where there are Champions League opportunities. And I think that's the question for us now. And as I say, I do think that the work that the Commission is doing in our small piece of this, which is the Digital Markets Act, to focus on issues like interoperability and data portability, may perhaps be exhibiting an understanding of that, right? That where we think about the technologies, the opportunities, the applications that sit on top of these new advanced services, the infrastructure itself, the large language models, perhaps that's where we want to focus our attention now.
And finally, a question, what would you recommend to those who are currently studying in European British universities doing their law degree?
So look, I mean, it's a period of remarkable change. I mean, that's come up so many times in the course of our really interesting conversation. It's a period of remarkable change, and that's only going to accelerate. I think that the importance of, as a student, being adaptable to that change is very acute. Be very ready for that kind of change. I think in the world of antitrust, that means that we're doing antitrust at the speed of artificial intelligence. That means that the ways that you start to think about how you're being taught about product market definitions and market power, that's now against the backdrop of markets that are developing in radically advanced and accelerating ways. The boundaries between different services seem to be blurring day by day, and you'll have to take that into the ways in which you think about antitrust. But I think more generally, when you think about the job that you're going to be doing, be ready for change would be a message that I would certainly share with my kids and with students who are starting to think about what they're going to be doing in the workplace. I think that it is a message of optimism and hope. I think that just, change is good. I mean, students now coming into law, to legal practices, whether it's in-house or in private practice or elsewhere, academia, you're coming into this now as AI natives. You're sort of the first generation of AI natives. And you are the people who will help us identify the ways in which we should use these legal tools to generate the benefits that are going to be most useful and worthwhile for society. And so that's a tremendous opportunity. So the ideas are going to come from there. Ollis, I'm afraid it's probably not you and I who are going to have the imagination and the creativity to be thinking about what really ought antitrust to be doing to ensure that AI delivers the benefits for consumers and businesses that it ought to. But it will be AI natives who are thinking creatively now about what it means to have competitive chatbots or wearable services that can be used by all the players. That sort of imagination, as they have the deepest understanding of the technology and how it's evolving, I think will be tremendously valuable and a very exciting and great opportunity for people.
Absolutely. Oliver Bethell, thank you very much indeed for sharing your ideas with us.
Anytime. Thanks, Ollis.